Okay, we're going to begin. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Humanitarians online event on the United Nations false climate neutrality claims. We're going to be exploring the issues that my colleagues have dug up during their extensive investigation, which we're going to link to now in the chat if you haven't already seen it. My name is Will Worley. I'm the editor and reporter of policy here at the New Humanitarian. We've got a great discussion lined up for you today. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. A recording of this event is going to be shared afterwards. So also welcome to our podcast listeners. And we're also streaming on YouTube and LinkedIn right now. So wherever you're tuning in, welcome and thanks so much. I'm going to move, before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to do a quick poll. We'd like to do these just to see how everyone is getting on and feeling ahead of COP. The poll question, which should be popping up on your screens now, there it is. With 2 weeks to go until COP, how are you feeling about where we're at in global efforts to combat climate change? So something nice and simple for you to chew on before we go ahead. We've asked similar questions to our audience at past online events. There's usually quite a lot of uncertainty, so we're interested in how you're feeling today with the summit so close. So do feel free to say hello in the chat and where you're from and where you work. Feel free to tweet during the event and tag at New Humanitarian. Subscribe to our free daily or weekly newsletter at thenewhumanitarian.org/subscribe. And a big thank you to our members and donors who continue to support our mission. For everyone's information, the members are readers who also donate on a monthly basis because they want to see this kind of accountability journalism thrive. And you can become a member by visiting thenewhumanitarian.org/membership. And by being a membership, you'll get free access to events like this and lots of other perks. All the links I've just mentioned will be coming up in the chat. So do make use of those. And please also do make use of the Q&A function. Let us know if you'd like to turn your mic on and answer your questions live or even your comments. I know we've got quite a few UN officials tuning in, so you can also ask us questions or make comments anonymously. If you want to share something privately with us, you can click my name and send me in Zoom and send me a link through the chat. Do continue sending the questions into our panel. So quite a lot of you are in a state of panic. Help, according to this poll. That's all right. I can empathize with that. Others are about 40% of you are feeling uncertain, not feel what the future holds. Yep, do join the club. Around a quarter say they are feeling tired, feels like we've worked so hard and only inched ahead. Well, welcome to journalism. Let's crack on. Okay, how do I move this? Right, let's begin the formal event. COP28 is right around the corner, and of course, we're all anticipating a heavy dose of reality checks. The prospect of a disagreement over a fossil fuel phase-out looms large, along with scattershot of climate finance pledges, particularly for adaptation and loss and damage. But against that backdrop, the UN itself is also facing scrutiny. Our joint investigation with Mongabay found that despite championing the need for urgent climate solutions, the UN's own claims of carbon neutrality amount to greenwashing. And not only that, but a number of projects the UN supports via carbon offset credits are linked to claims of environmental damage, displacement, and health problems. It's not just the UN, plenty of other organizations, particularly in the private sector, who claim to be promoting climate actions, also rely on carbon offsetting to, in their words, reduce the environmental impact of some of their work. We want to host this conversation to dive a bit deeper into some of the findings from our investigation, particularly at this time so close to COP, and as the UN is positioned as a moral leader in the fight against climate change and running the negotiations to combat global warming. We wanted to ask whether the UN's false claims of climate neutrality undermine its wider efforts and credibility to address global warming, and also to think about whether there are alternative ways that the UN and the wider aid sector can frame efforts to address climate change that others can learn from. So, onto our panel. We've got two of our journalists who work painstakingly on this investigation. Our investigations editor, Paisley Dodds, and reporter Jacob Goldberg. We're also joined from outside by Dikolela Kalubi, the Planetary Health Coordinator for MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Joe Romm, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. Thanks, Joe, for coming. We did invite the UN to participate in this conversation officially, but they didn't respond to our invitation. But as I said earlier, there are plenty of UN folks tuning in, and do not be shy. We'd be keen to hear your thoughts, whether that's pushback or kind of how this investigation may have sparked any internal conversations in your organizations. So let's start the conversation by turning to you, Jacob, who painstakingly worked on this investigation for the best part of the year. Nice to see you again, Jacob. Can you tell our viewers today what the most significant findings of the investigation?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Will. Before we did this investigation, we already knew a few important things, and that was that the UN claimed to be climate neutral and that they did so by buying carbon credits from the Clean Development Mechanism. We also knew that the Clean Development Mechanism has been heavily criticized for more than a decade for selling carbon credits that experts say don't really reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But what we didn't know was whether the UN's claim was false, and that's because there was a chance that the UN was selecting the highest quality Clean Development Mechanism credits available. So the most significant finding for us was actually knowing which offsetting projects the UN bought their credits from. By knowing which projects they bought their credits from, we could compare that list of projects to existing research on different types of projects, whether they be hydropower or wind or other types of offsetting projects. What we found was that more than half of the 6.6 million credits we tracked down belong to project types that experts say don't really reduce the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We also found that at least 13 projects were linked to reports of various types of harm on surrounding communities, whether it be burning trash and polluting the air that makes people sick, or in one infamous case, it was a hydropower dam that destroyed land that was very important to indigenous communities in Brazil. There were 13 of those other projects that were linked to instances of displacement in China. Those were probably the most significant findings. One more, which the UN told us, was that the UN does not select its carbon credits. They're assigned randomly. So even though there was a possibility that they could have selected the highest quality credits from the Clean Development Mechanism, they told us they don't do that. They treat them all equally. And what ends up happening when you assign Clean Development Mechanism credits randomly is that you end up with a lot of low quality ones, which is what ended up happening.
Thanks, Jacob. That's a great overview. Appreciate it. Joe, I'm going to turn to you next, if that's okay. We quoted you in the investigation saying that it matters what the United Nations does, as the UN is effectively overseeing the world's effort to address the climate problem. Do you think the fact that the UN's claim to be carbon neutral, if proven false, undermines its leadership now at this crucial time, particularly approaching COP28?
There you go. Sorry. Well, as I've said, I think in the interview, yes, I think it matters a great deal. The United Nations has been running the Clean Development Mechanism for, since 2006. So, it really should understand, because there's been many published criticisms of the Clean Development Mechanism, that, the majority of, the offsets are not considered to be real. That is to say, either they would have happened anyway, or they have been overcounted, or they're not permanent. There are many flaws that people have identified in offsets, So yes, and I want to make the other point that really the notion of climate neutrality has really fallen out of fashion. In the last 18 months since Glasgow, there have been an amazing amount of lawsuits against, particularly in Europe. You saw, for instance, the soccer federation was brought to Swiss. The Swiss regulator was asked to adjudicate whether the claims that the World Cup 2022 in Qatar was carbon neutral, and they found no, it wasn't, and you needed to stop making that claim. And we've seen that, I believe it's in Dutch court, Shell has repeatedly tried to come up with a phrase to describe its oil, that makes it sound climate friendly, and I think they've lost in court 4 times. And the British Standards Authority has also said, please don't use the term climate neutral. And I think what the EU itself has basically said, the term is meaningless, it's misleading, it's greenwashing. So I think that there are, I would say, and by the way, also the UN expert group, on non-player, non-state actors making net zero commitments said, please, stop with this, carbon neutral stuff. So I think that the serious companies are moving away from that claim. I think the United Nations should move away from that claim. I think that what we've learning is everyone has to reduce their own emissions. Everyone can't foist those emissions reductions on other companies or countries or entities. Fundamentally, if we're going to get to zero or as close to zero as possible, everyone's going to have to get close to zero, right? You just can't pass those offsets and say, oh, this person's going to get to, he's going to go below zero, so I can stay above zero, right? That's, so these things matter. And then last point that I made is that, coming up in COP28, we're going to have the continuing discussions of how we finish the discussions of Article 6 and what is an authorized offset in the Paris regulated market. And right now, the UN is going to be running that program, right? The UN is going to be running this authorized offset program after 15, 16 years of not doing a particularly great job on the clean development outcomes. So it really is incumbent on the United Nations to be a leader here. And if you want to do a real offset, then you're going to have to do the kind that was agreed upon in Glasgow, right? This is an authorized offset, and in this offset, companies have to agree, countries that are doing the offset have to agree, we're not counting that offset. I don't want to get into all the details here, but the point is the nations of the world have agreed on what an authorized offset is. It is going to be much more expensive and much more genuine than the stuff that sells on the voluntary market for $2 a ton. And I think we all know, and I hope all the listeners know, that if we could solve the climate problem for $2 a ton, none of us would be here. We'd all be doing something else. Real emissions reductions price is like the European trading system. It's close to 90 euros, $100 a ton. And unless you're paying that amount, you can be pretty sure that you're buying junk.
Thanks, Joe. And I think it's a really important distinction you make between private companies who are ultimately trying to sell a product to consumers and the United Nations, who are in charge of setting the global rules or shaping the negotiations around the global rules, not only for carbon offsets, but also the discussions around an overall fossil fuel phase down or phase out, targets around adaptation, targets around loss and damage. They really have a crucial point in the credibility piece here. So Paisley, if I could turn to you next. As well as our investigation into the UN's claims, we also did an investigation as TNH into the aid sector's carbon footprint. So why do you think it's important for TNH to hold the UN and the aid sector accountable on issues like this? Shouldn't they maybe, should we go a bit more softly because they're dealing with such troubled issues?
Yeah, thanks, Will. So yeah, as you pointed out, I mean, it was really our first investigation that looked at the aid sector's overall carbon footprint, that kind of laid the groundwork for the investigation that we did recently. And as Jacob pointed out, what we found in that investigation was that the UN didn't measure all of its emissions. So in basic science, if you don't measure all of your emissions, then it makes it really, really difficult to call yourself carbon or climate neutral, or to even know how large your carbon footprint is so you can reduce the emissions. So going back to your question, why does this matter? Yes, it's absolutely true that the UN is not the biggest polluter. It's also absolutely true, and to be fair to the UN, that the UN and NGOs do incredibly important work. And as we're seeing in Gaza and other places around the world, everyone knows that the UN workers and NGOs lose their lives or are killed in the process of doing that really great humanitarian and critical humanitarian work that they do every day. But in a world that feels pretty unanchored right now, the UN provides a moral compass on some of these biggest issues that we're facing. And one of the biggest issues, as everyone knows, is the climate crisis. If the UN isn't walking the walk, then what message does that send to companies, to governments, and to other organizations? And critically, as a taxpayer funded organization, shouldn't it be accountable to those who fund it? We think so.
We do. Thanks, Paisley. I just want to remind the audience about the Q&A function, which you should be seeing in your chat. We do have one question in there, but it's a bit specific, so maybe we'll get to that in a bit after we've done some of the more contextual pieces of the conversation. And yeah, anyone from the UN who is attending here today who might like to respond to some of the comments that have come up, we can either get you on stage or do send us a comment anonymously if you prefer, and we can get your perspectives in. We would like to do that. So on the theme of organizations working in troubled places that have done have made some difficult decisions around their climate neutrality claims, MSF Dekaleda has made the decision not to buy carbon credits anymore. And can you tell us what prompted that decision and what MSF is doing now?
Yeah, thank you. So at MSF, we consider climate change as a humanitarian and health crisis. We work in some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, where we are responding to health consequences of climate change. For instance, this year, we have been responding to Cyclone Freddy in Madagascar, to massive flood in South Sudan, to the change of the pattern of disease in Mozambique, or to malnutrition in the Horn of Africa, and so on. What we see is that the patients that we treat are among the hardest hit by climate change. So, as a medical organization, and also in line with the do not harm principle, it's a kind of moral obligation, I would say, to reduce the environmental impact of our activities. In addition to that, it's clear that there is a scientific consensus on the fact that the only way, or the best way to mitigate climate change, is to reduce massively and rapidly greenhouse gas emission. So it's a collective effort, and we have decided to do our part without relying on carbon offsetting. So what we have done instead was to measure our carbon footprint and to publish our climate and environmental roadmap, where we define or we describe what are the key actions that the organization needs to take in order to reduce by 50% its carbon emission by 2030, in line with the Paris Agreement. And very soon, we will also publish our progress reports to highlight successes, but also to highlight what is not on track, because the idea is not to showcase how good we are, but more to explain what needs to be done. Those documents are public because we want it to be fully transparent and accountable.
So MSF has had its own sort of mini global stock take within the institution then. Okay. I would like to does anyone else want to come in on that, perhaps from the audience or anyone else, just to respond to what Deco has said, or I can move on to the next question. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question, and we'll come back to that when we have a bit more, when it's more will fit more with the conversation. Joe, I'd like to turn to you again, if that's okay. I mean, is there even such a thing as high quality carbon offsets? And, you know, if the UN and others in the aid sector are going to lead by example, what should they be doing?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that is, a question that is really at the focus of everyone in the in the climate community. A couple of points on that. I think that it is very hard in this world to do a quote unquote voluntary offset in the unregulated market that you could have any assurance is quality. Right. And the key point is this: people have to understand the voluntary market, where the corporations and others are buying offsets in general, not the CDM. The clean development mechanism has, it has been widely criticized for lots of questionable projects, including hydropower and other projects that would have happened anyway or have other impacts. In the voluntary market, it's unregulated. It's wild west, as we say here in America, and so anybody can issue a credit for any reason, and it could be worthless or not. And if I say to you, I'm going to sell you a high quality ton, and you're going to pay $50 a ton, but Qatar starts their, or the Saudi Arabia, right, launches their own carbon crediting program and says, I'm going to sell you a ton for $10, right? Why would you buy my ton when you can buy their ton? So the voluntary market is a complete race to the bottom. There's nobody who can guarantee quality, who can say this is a real ton and this isn't a real ton. And that's why, as you say, a lot of players, Nestle has moved away from purchasing offsets, from making any carbon neutral claims. So the question of high quality offsets, as you know, I'm sure most listeners know of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is the group that works with more companies and other entities to come up with what is a credible plan to get to net zero in 2050. And they're working with thousands of companies, and their published rules are that you can't even use any carbon credits until you've reduced your own emissions 90% to 95%, right? And then at that point, you can use quote unquote high quality carbon removal. And so I think when you're talking about what is a high quality carbon credit, I think the way to look at it is it needs to be a very verifiable, quantifiable, and monitorable thing, and permanent, right? Because CO2, when you release in the air, like, it lasts centuries. So it's not good enough to plant a tree that might, take 20 years to grow, and then it might burn down after 20 years, right? You have to really pay attention to these things. So I think, there are such a thing as high quality carbon removal tons, but they are very expensive, right? I mean, direct air capture, right? Pulling CO2 out of the air is very, CO2 is very diffuse in the air, right? 420 parts per million. So it's really very energy intensive to do that. And there are other, high quality carbon removal tons that people talk about. The vast majority of them are considerably over $100 a ton. And most people, and I've written a couple of papers myself, and by the way, I put in the chat my email address and a link to the offset paper that I did in June, which goes through a lot of these issues. But yes, the point right now is that most of the things that are considered to be high quality carbon removal tons are not scalable, which is to say they're just, you can buy them, and if it makes you feel good, that's fine, but it's not something the entire world can do. We're not going to solve the climate problem, right, by pulling all the CO2 out of the air. I mean, aside from the staggering amount of energy that would consume, where are you going to put all of this CO2, right? You're going to build all these pipelines of CO2 and ship it to places where you're going to store it. Again, I'm not saying you can't do this at a small scale, but at a large scale that we need, the world has 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases, right? That's what we have to deal with. And, in the United, in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they are quite skeptical of direct air capture. And, every year, the International Energy Agency releases their 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. and the net zero by 2050 scenario. And in September, they released theirs. And, direct air capture has 700 megatons, 0.7 gigatons, right? Well, that'd be nice in 2050. Could it be done? Maybe. Is it the best use of our resources and renewables? I don't know. But it's, compared to the 50 gigatons, it's just not a game changer. The game changer is when we start spending a lot of money, even more money, deploying solar, wind, electrifying the economy, electric vehicles, batteries, the things we're doing now. We just have to do it at about 2 or 3 times the rate that we're doing.
Thanks, Joe. I feel like feel-good credits has a pretty good sort of ring to it, though it's not quite what's needed to solve the climate crisis. I mean, for me as a journalist, I didn't work on this investigation. I could clarify. My colleagues here did, but I did not. I think what really sticks out is that everyone understands that this is a very difficult issue to solve. But the real kind of problem with this lies with the claim to be almost carbon neutral that's been made by the United Nations. And as Dico said, transparency really is key. So I'd like to come to you again, Dico, and just ask a bit more about what some of the challenges humanitarian organizations face in reducing their carbon footprints, and how important do you think it is for the aid sector to overcome these challenges?
I would say the biggest challenge is that we have to respond to growing humanitarian needs. Some of them are related to climate change, while at the same time reducing our own environmental footprint. So I would say this growth is already a challenge. A second challenge that we face is that we are working in contexts where access to essential services such as electricity, waste treatment facilities is not always available. So we have to come up with solutions that are innovative and adapted to the context. To give you an example, here in Geneva, it's quite easy, I would say, to rely 100% on renewable energy. You just have to pay a premium to the city grid. But when we have to deploy solar solution in Chad in the middle of nowhere to power health facilities, the context is definitely a challenge. Another challenge is related to the fact that I would say the humanitarian system has been designed to deploy staff and goods fast and in an efficient way in a remote area. So it has been quite successful to deliver humanitarian assistance to millions of people affected by conflict, outbreak of disease, and so on. But the system relies heavily on fossil fuel. And if we want to reduce our carbon footprint, we have to change practices, mindset, and behaviors. So it's not something that can be achieved overnight. It's definitely a long journey. Finally, I would say also there is a financial challenge. We all know that the humanitarian sector is facing serious financial constraint. And we know that if we want to reduce our environmental footprint, we have to invest more. So I think here it's a little bit, it's a kind of challenge, and we have to raise awareness of the donors about the fact that, yes, if we want to reduce our environmental footprint, we need to invest more. But maybe to conclude, I would say there are many challenges, but there are also, I would say, many benefits. For instance, in Burkina Faso, we have installed solar panel in a remote place because regular fuel supply was challenging due to security reasons. And here we have a good example where we can achieve operational continuity and financial saving while at the same time reducing our own environmental footprint.
Thank you. Jacob, let's come back to yourself. Was there anything surprising that you saw in terms of reactions, or perhaps a lack of reaction to the investigations? Why didn't the UN respond? Why wasn't there more public comment or statements from humanitarians and others?
Yeah, well, there's two surprising things that are sort of at odds with each other. One is that my sources at the UN were very forthcoming with the information I needed to draw these conclusions about their offsetting. I requested their records, their transaction records for carbon credits, which listed the projects that those credits came from. It took a really long time, but they did, and each UN entity sort of had to make its own decision about whether to supply that information. And I think 15 ultimately did not, and said that the information was proprietary. But most of them did supply the data, allowed me to analyze it. And that's how we know now that more than half of the the credits that we identified, which make up about 75% of what they bought in total, come from project types that are not effective at reducing emissions. But when we brought those findings to the UN, suddenly they were less responsive. It took a long time to get a response to very detailed questions that basically went through all of the points that I've mentioned earlier. We asked them their response to that. And they didn't respond to any questions about the specific projects, any of our findings about the harm that projects have caused to people in their communities. They just basically said that they rely on the standards of the CDM. And again, the CDM has been discredited by experts for a very long time, more than a decade. So yeah, I wish they would have responded to each question. I wish they would have answered questions about how their investments went to companies that are contributing to harm, and then claiming climate neutrality based on those purchases. Maybe that's for a future story.
We have an audience question I'd like to bring in now. What's the name of the company or the companies selling these carbon credits?
Oh, there's hundreds. But if you go to the link where our investigation is published and you scroll down, I think a bit more than halfway through, you will see a little slideshow of that shows each of the 13 projects that we found was connected to some type of harm on the community. And these are different types of harm, they're different types of projects. And I'll say that the harm that these projects cause to the communities is unrelated to whether it reduces greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It could be effective at reductions. Most of these turned out not to be, but even if it did, these are still harmful to people. And for example, one of them, waste to energy plant in New Delhi, was emitting toxic particles above 9 times above the permitted level. And hospitals, our doctor in one of the local hospitals said that people come in with respiratory problems all the time, and they believe it's related to this plant that's burning plastic and is selling carbon credits based on that burning to the UN. Another one, yeah, like I said, is so yeah, you'll find the name of that company if you just flick through that slideshow in the link. And another one is I know the name of the company, Teles Pires hydroelectric company. They're the ones who operate this big hydropower dam in the Amazon, and they had to blow up an indigenous holy site to build that, and it's also contributed to deforestation in the area.
Pretty incredible. Joe, I saw you nodding along. I wonder if there's anything you wanted to say just to give a bit of further context to that. And while maybe you're there, perhaps explain to some of our viewers the issues, just recapping the issues of why the CDM is problematic.
Well, you know, the CDM, just so people understand, you know, the Clean Development Mechanism was set up as part of the effort to allow countries to meet the targets under the Kyoto Protocol, which was a 1997 agreement among the nations of the world, a precursor, if you will, to Paris. But in the case of the Clean Development Mechanism, the rich countries, the developing countries, the developed countries all had to make modest emissions reduction targets. This was a 1997 agreement, and they typically had to be by 2010, they had to be a few percent below 1990 levels. The developing countries did not have any targets. And the Clean Development Mechanism allowed the rich countries to do projects in the poorer countries that would supposedly, reduce emissions, and then use those offsets so that the rich countries could continue to pollute. And so we actually ended up, the literature is pretty clear on this, in the worst of both possible worlds, which is that it's very unclear that any emissions were actually reduced in developing countries that wouldn't have been reduced anyway. But we are very sure that those offsets were used by the rich countries so they wouldn't actually have to make reductions under the Kyoto Protocol. So, there's studies out there that actually say that the clean development mechanism resulted in an increase in total emissions. And, I in the paper, I just make a couple of points. During the time frame of the Kyoto Protocol, 2006 to present, right, the single biggest issuer of clean development mechanism credits was China. Yet China's total greenhouse gas global warming emissions doubled during that time period, right? So China managed to develop in a, it's supposed to be clean development, right? China developed not, in a dirty way, but along the way it did build some clean plants, and it sold those tons off to the rich countries who then could use it so they wouldn't actually have to make their own emissions. So as you can see, it really was a very perverse thing. And, many analyses said that it was that such a design could never possibly work. And I would point out that a very large fraction of the Chinese offsets were hydropower. And these were hydropower plants that many countries were building without offsets. It just became, it was a very cost-effective thing to do, right? I mean, hydropower in the United States is among the cheapest power there is. So you were building these hydropower dams that A, would have been built anyway. B, as was mentioned, hydropower dam is going to flood whoever the indigenous and local communities are, right? They are going to have their homes destroyed, right? That's what happens when you dam up a river, right? You flood all of the area around the river, and people live along rivers because, it has water, it has fish, it has transportation. So, and then the third point, by the way, is that the literature is also clear. If you build a dam in a tropical place, and you dam up the water right, you're going to see all this vegetation flooded, and it is going to convert to methane, right? It's going to decay, convert to methane, and emit. And this is very well known. And those should not be permitted under the Clean Development Mechanism, because supposedly the Clean Development Mechanism, in fact, is supposed to support things that reduce emissions. And if something is going to actually release a lot of methane, you at least have to calculate that in, and say these credits are worth a lot less than we thought. So the point is the whole system was by, from the very beginning designed in a way that really could not succeed. And as it was implemented, it did not result in net reductions. And there have been articles, peer-reviewed articles that have said it actually led to an emissions net increase across the planet of billions of tons.
Thanks, Joe. That was really illuminating. Paisley, perhaps we can turn to you. I mean, is there any further information on the UN on what if our investigation has maybe sparked any sort of internal conversations, or if there is any sort of better read on the organization's actual emissions?
Yeah, if I may, just something that Jacob might want to talk about, and something that Joe and I talked about when we did the interview. One of the other surprising things about this investigation that we did was the plain truth that the UN has all of these advisory panels of some of the world's best scientists, and it's not clear that the UN is actually listening to some of those panelists, which I'd love to hear Joe talk a little bit more about, and Jacob. I mean, in terms of what the UN is doing, I mean, Jacob kind of touched on this. I mean, one of the big questions that we had, and as journalists, something that we always hope is going to come out of these investigations, is whether they'll at least review our findings. And for this story, this investigation in particular, the big question is, will they investigate and consider stop funding these 13 problematic carbon offsetting schemes that we found? We don't know the answer to that yet. We're very happy to do a follow-up story on that. We're very happy to listen to any reviews that they're undertaking, whether they be now or by the end of the year. In terms of whether it will consider stop using the phrase climate and carbon neutral. I mean, that's another big question. I have more faith in us doing a follow-up and asking the UN to actually consider the 13 projects than I do in the UN reviewing whether they are going to abandon the phrase carbon neutral.
Thanks. And I
Will,
hope that's gone some way to answering the question about whether the UN is doing anywhere near as much as it could to reduce its carbon intensive activities. But I'm going to turn to Jacob next.
yeah, I think that this might just be a good time to say that when the UN claims to be almost completely climate neutral, that's in their annual Greening the Blue reports. It's also where they publish all their data about how about their annual emissions and how much they offset. The report for this year, which is going to reflect 2022 emissions, is probably going to come out at the end of this month. That's what I last heard. So if anyone wants to know if they took our reporting to heart, check and see if they continued to claim to be climate neutral, see if they continued to offset. That's something that I'm very interested in finding. I think that will be very telling. Like Paisley said, I don't know. I don't expect everything we report to have an immediate impact, but hopefully it's something they're considering.
Joe, did you just want to come in on further on Paisley's point about the UN having access to some of the best scientists in the world and indeed being responsible for a lot of climate science out there?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. I think the point that I made to her when we were talking was that, right, so you have the United Nations is making all these climate neutral claims, but the other part of the UN, right, it runs the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC, which every 5 years or so and issues a major report on the state of the science and the state of the solutions. And in 2022, they issued their big report, 2,900-page report by all the world's experts on how you solve the climate problem, on how you mitigate climate change. And one of the points that the paper makes is that we should be, quote, focusing on direct emissions reductions within their own territory. They're talking about countries, and, quote, minimal reliance on offsets. So, you have this scientific body, right, that has been assembled by the UN. It's been writing reports on climate for a very long time. And, here are the world's experts overseen by the UN saying, don't use offsets. And I would add that, in Egypt, COP27, the UN's own the Secretary General got like many of the well-known experts from around the world. I think led by I think it was Canada's former environment administrator, and created this UN high-level expert group on net zero emission commitments by non-state entities. And that group released its report. Again, it's the UN expert group. It released its report in Egypt. And it said, non-state actors must prioritize urgent and deep reduction of emission across their value chain. And you really should not be using carbon credits or carbon offsets for quote unquote, for anything like carbon neutrality. And it reiterated that it believes that people should have science-based targets and follow, that approach. So, and it basically said that, companies should not be using any offsets they buy in the voluntary market to make any claims about emissions reductions or net zero for the foreseeable future. So, I don't know why the UN assembles, world experts on an expert panel to advise, the world on how non-state actors should, make net zero claims and not follow their advice. Right. So it's you have one hand not one hand not talking to the other hand. It's just very frustrating that one part of the UN is ignoring the science on the one hand, ignoring expert groups on the other hand. I understand the UN is a very large organization with many different entities, but climate is the single biggest problem facing the entire planet, and one would hope that the UN would use its own experts to make decisions on what it does itself to deal with its own emissions.
And if I can just jump in on that, just trying to connect the journalism with what we're talking about today. I mean, one of the cardinal rules in journalism is that you can't cherry pick information, quotes, material, evidence to fit a narrative. And I think that, certainly what we're seeing in climate change and in our reporting with the UN is that seems, or at least appears to be exactly what's happening. And to Joe's point, the question is why?
Thank you. Deco, you spoke a little bit about changing practices, mindsets, and behaviors, and obviously the UN has some work to do on this. But I wonder if you could give a little bit of a picture to us about how that looks in practice for MSF, please.
In practice, so in our roadmap, we have more than 30 key actions that need to be taken by the organization. So they cover different domains like our medical practices, our energy consumption, the way that we travel, and so on. So for all the different actions that we are trying to input, we focus, I would say, on three key interventions. The first one is related to the technology, for instance, putting solar panels. The second one is related to the processes, to see what we can improve in order to optimize the use of resources. For instance, we are working with our colleagues from the supply to see how we can have better forecasting in order to reduce the use of plane to transport goods. And finally, we are looking also at our individual behaviors. For instance, at the moment, we have a campaign in Lebanon where we try to sensitize our medical staff on the use of medical gloves. The idea is how we can reduce the consumption of medical gloves only when it's needed, in order to reduce the waste of gloves with some medical practices that do not require gloves.
How has that gone down in the field? Has there been much pushback, or has it been a difficult thing to implement?
As I say, as a medical organization, our first priority is really to respond to growing humanitarian needs, but it doesn't mean that we cannot do that while at the same time reducing our environmental impact. I think it's a matter of being pragmatic and to find solutions that are added value for the environment, but also for our operation. But to be fully honest, it's not an easy and simple task, I would say. It's a long journey, and it's why we know that it will take time and that we have to report and to explain where we are. Sometimes it's related to the context, sometimes it's because we are facing internal reluctance, but the idea is really to find some pragmatic solution that is good for our vision, but also that we can at the same time reduce our
Thank you. Just a further reminder to our audience to pop your questions in the chat box. It'd be great to hear your thoughts and to get everyone's to get people's ideas in there. Paisley, if I could turn to you again, in our reporting, are you seeing any positive signs that people in the humanitarian sector are actually leading by example when it comes to talking about and acting on efforts to become climate neutral?
Sure. I mean, as some of our panelists noted, it's hard, if not impossible, to be carbon neutral if you're still using fossil fuels. So that's the big elephant in the room. So you either stop calling yourself carbon neutral and climate neutral, or you stop investing in junk credits, and particularly carbon offsetting schemes that do no harm. We've already seen some groups like MSF taking a stand against investing in carbon offsetting schemes. As our story pointed out, Oxfam was one of the other groups, though even though it still invests in carbon offsetting schemes, it acknowledges the need to move away from them. And it also talks about not counting them in their overall emissions reductions. So yeah, I think that a lot of organizations in the sector are doing things and certainly talking about it. And I think that as there's more scrutiny around carbon offsetting programs in general, and hopefully more reporting, not just ours, but others, around this, that I think that you'll see probably some more movement in the sector.
And Jacob, in terms of other people reporting on this, how do you feel like issues such as carbon offsetting are covered more broadly by the media? Do you think journalists are on top of these issues and effectively holding power to account, or do you think there are some gaps in the reporting?
Yeah, so I spent a year learning everything I could about offsetting sort of from the ground up. I don't have a background in this. And what I found is that most of the major literature on carbon offsetting and why it wasn't really achieving what it was meant to was published more than 10 years ago. This is, I think we sort of came late, but this issue was waiting for us, so it was opportune. But most of the literature that we based our analysis on was published by experts years and years ago. So for some reason, I don't know, that messaging hasn't penetrated. Well, as Joe said, maybe it has penetrated in some sectors, but maybe not in the one we're reporting on. Any company or organization that claims to be climate neutral or to have achieved net zero, you do any digging and you're going to find offsetting. And if you dig into offsetting, you're going to find low quality offsetting. So anyone could have done this at any time. I think it's maybe not such a popular topic for investigative journalists right now, but maybe that's because scientists tend to be the ones doing this work, because it is very scientifically demanding. And it took a lot for us to speak to a lot of experts and muster the confidence to come to the conclusions we did. Maybe more journalists could be attracted to the topic if they were working closely with experts, but I think maybe the way we tend, I guess journalists tend to work parallel to experts. So if they've published a report, then we maybe don't see it as necessarily our priority to do that work again. But maybe there's room to work side by side from the beginning, so that the research, like the type of research we included in our investigation, could get a wider audience. And I'll just say that we interviewed experts from Carbon Market Watch. They put out reports similar to what our investigation all the time. Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, the Stockholm Environment Institute. Not all of those do offsetting investigations all the time. Carbon Market Watch does. If you're interested in this topic, I would definitely follow them.
And if I could just add a couple of other points. I mean, we do surveys all the time, and we are painfully aware of what audiences want to read and what they don't. Unfortunately, journalists across the board are facing lots of news fatigue, and particularly news fatigue about climate crisis coverage in general. When you throw in lots of complicated science to that, it makes our jobs really, really difficult to make sure that people want to read the stories. I would say that from the outset. The other thing is that not that many journalists cover the aid sector particularly. We are one of the few news organizations that does that consistently. But we're also a very small news organization, and we have limited resources. At the end of the day, we have to greenlight investigations, very few investigations each year, because of the resources that we have. And as Jacob pointed out, it took us a year and a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of dedication to not only report the story, but just to figure out a way that it would translate to something that may have impact and that readers will want to read and be interested in and be informed by. So again, I mean, that's something that we tackle as a news organization, but also writ large, it's something that journalists are tackling every day when they try to get readers interested and audiences interested in just how bad this climate crisis is.
Thanks, Paisley. We've had a really interesting question. It's from Andreas, and he asks if there is some research on the distribution of emissions between office and field work. Did you come across that in the course of your investigation, Jacob?
No, and I think that would have been that would have been something that we looked into in the initial investigation in 2021 in the looking at the aid sector's carbon footprint. That investigation didn't focus on the UN specifically, and if it had, it probably would have included that point. But if you want to find the answer to that, you can look through the Greening the Blue report and look through the difference between, well, I don't know if that would be captured by scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but potentially. So yeah, sorry, long answer is they have that information. It didn't come up in this investigation, but I think that you could find it in their emissions reports.
Oh, let's go back to you so we can make the most of your expertise while you're with us. Something else you've written about is Europe treating bioenergy as if it's carbon neutral. Can you just tell us what you think about that, please?
Yeah, Europe has embraced this notion that if you burn biomass at let's say a power plant, that the emissions of and let's talk particularly about trees, because as Europe has scaled up its bioenergy use, the vast majority of the increase has been done by cutting down trees and turning it into wood pellets and running that through, a boiler and either creating heat or creating power. So Europe has taken this view that the emissions from the biomass plant are zero, and that all of the emissions are going to be accounted for by the place that cut down the trees, by the country or place that cut down the trees. That's the way Europe operates. And there are 2 different letters by hundreds and hundreds of scientists saying, this is just a terrible idea, because basically what Europe did was it motivated people to cut down trees and burn them to replace coal as part of the EU's commitment to reduce its emissions and increase its renewable energy. But the problem, of course, is that the net result was a lot of deforestation. And there was a big article in the New York Times last November, I think it was, which said, you can Google it, Europe is cutting down its ancient forests, for energy. There has been major deforesting in Finland and Estonia. You have a lot of what appears to be illegal logging in places like Romania. Now, and a lot of the wood pellets come from the United States, the Southeast United States. And it's not clear that any of those countries are accounting for their emissions, themselves. So, Europe is really playing a very dangerous game here. And 60% of the increase in renewable energy from Europe in the past 15 to 20 years has been bioenergy. And by pretending it is zero emissions is just leading to rampant deforestation. And there's one other point that I would make in that paper, because that bioenergy paper, we did some original modeling with the En-ROADS people. The climate interactive people have a very good model that can model different climate solutions globally over decades. And people say, oh, well, biomass energy is carbon neutral because, yes, when you burn it, it releases emissions, but when you replant the trees, right, it absorbs the CO2 back. Well, that's true, but it takes a long time for trees to grow enough to get that CO2 back. And so there's a carbon debt. This is talked about in the IPCC mitigation report and elsewhere. If you scale up bioenergy, if you scale up bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, every year you're cutting down more trees, and then you're burning them, and then you're planting little saplings, which take a couple decades to grow. But what you're doing is cutting down more trees every year. And so as long as you're cutting down more trees, the carbon debt grows and emissions rise and the climate warms up. So in the real world, if you scale up biomass energy as Europe has done, what you're just doing is deforesting. That's what you're doing. And you should think of scaling up bioenergy as deforestation, because they're not much different. And I go through the longer detailed life cycle analysis to make this point. But the best thing to do with trees is to just let them grow, right? When you cut down a tree, you don't just lose the carbon in that tree, right? You lose the carbon you would have stored if you would let the tree keep growing and storing CO2, right? So you have that lost CO2, and then you have the CO2 that comes from burning the tree, and then you have the CO2 comes from processing the tree into pellets. You have to dry them out, because you can't burn stuff with a high water content, because that doesn't get you as much energy. So you have to use energy to transport the trees and the pellets. You have to use energy to dry them out. Then you run them through the biomass power plant, and you release the emissions. So on whole, you're releasing a lot of emissions, and you don't get most of that back until decades later from the seedlings that you planted, if the seedlings grow to maturity. And of course, there are lots of things that kill seedlings, floods, fires, pests. And in reality, when you look at the studies, typically only about half the seedlings make it to 5 years. So it is biomass energy is not a good idea. It is not a climate solution, and Europe should not be embracing it. And in the United States, we have our own form of bioenergy, which is terrible, which is corn ethanol, right? Where we're burning crops to make fuel, which is literally the worst idea that you could possibly have in a world that has trouble feeding itself today. And in 2050, right, we're going to have 2 billion more people, and people eating more protein, right? So the notion, the U.S. burns 2/5 of its corn crop.
Sorry, Joe, to cut you off there. I apologize.
Yeah,
some questions come in. Thank you for it, and do check out the Mongabay story, which is linked to in the chat on biomass. We've had a question come in from Ahmed at the UNHCR, who says that UN is a very large organization, works all over the place, in different countries with all sorts of conditions and energy mixtures and qualities of energy supply. So they may need to rely on fossil fuels, something like diesel generators. As the countries hosting UN entities themselves move towards clean energy, it will also help the UN to move away from fossil fuels and reduce use of diesel generators. What are your thoughts on that? Deco, perhaps you could give us your response.
Yes. So sorry, I was reading the question. Now, I think, as we said before, it's quite challenging to reduce the environmental footprint of an organization, given the context where we operate. But we also see many opportunities to do so. Even if it's challenging, I think there are opportunities and benefits to do it. And the example of energy is a good one. I think it's true that in the context where we work, we rely heavily on fossil fuel, diesel generator, because access to electricity is not available, or quality of the grid is not good. But using more renewable energy is a good way, I would say, to have environmental benefits, but also as cheap financial savings, because we know that we have to invest more at the beginning, but then we can have an interesting return on investment. But beyond that, I would say it's not only about technology, it's also related to behavior, because the greenest and the cheapest energy is the one that we don't use. So I think also changing our behavior on how we use air conditioning system in offices and so on, it's simple things that could be done and that are quite impactful. So I don't know if I did answer to the question, because I didn't have time to read it through.
No, of course, and it's a really big question. It encompasses operations all over the globe. And Ahmed made another really interesting point. This more of a comment than a question, but I think it probably encapsulates a lot of the issues at play here. He says, quote, "Also from UNHCR's perspective, I would say that given the shrinking funding in the humanitarian sector, it will be very difficult to move the available funding from responding to humanitarian crises to reducing the UNHCR's own emissions." So some interesting food for thought there. If anyone wants to come in on that, they're more than welcome. Okay.
I'll just address that. I mean, I think that's a really fair point, and it's something that we certainly try to acknowledge in a lot of our reporting. That being said, there are some decisions that the UN could make and other organizations could make, and I think that that's kind of what we were suggesting. We weren't trying to boil the ocean, as they say. Perhaps that's wrong to talk about boiling the ocean on a climate Zoom webinar. But I think that, from our perspective, there are some small steps that the UN could take to at least go some way in walking the walk when it comes to making some significant changes in terms of climate action.
Thanks, Paisley. I want to draw everyone's attention to sorry, Jacob, do go ahead, and then I'll draw everyone's attention to the thing.
Yeah. I just want to say that Ahmed's comment is right. It's going to be difficult, but yeah, this story wasn't trying to hold the UN accountable for not being climate neutral. It's a story about greenwashing, which some would say is a type of misinformation, and we need to see better information coming from the UN. For everyone to make progress, for everyone to reduce their emissions, everyone needs to understand that the claim of climate neutrality is dubious. The claim of net zero is dubious. Our goals need to be correct in order to reach something productive. And if people get credit for claiming to be climate neutral, then we won't be aiming for the correct thing.
Thanks, Jacob. I want to point out a comment in the Q&A. I'm not sure if the broader audience can see it, but they first of all point to the Carbon Action Accelerator, which has supported some of the member organizations on assessing distribution of emissions between office and field work, I think presumably at the UN. This person continues to say, in the UN, this data is generally available at entity level. So the investigation that TNH did has led to a lot of discussion internally in the UN, this person says, then continues, quote, the use of the term carbon neutral comes from the UN sustainability strategy, which also refers to offsets and has specific targets related to carbon neutrality. So would probably need changes and updates in the strategy or its implementation to change this. But point well taken, and many within the UN are also well aware. So thanks very much for that comment, which is really valuable. And if you do want to talk further, we're always happy to listen. We're not looking to bash anyone. We're looking to report fairly. Paisley, maybe we could turn to you to just get your take on where this story goes next then.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we're not about gotcha journalism. We report facts, and what we really want to do is give our readers and audiences a fuller picture. So with that in mind, the first thing that I would say is that Jacob did a fantastic job in trying to get a broader picture of the UN's total carbon offset portfolio, but we still don't have that. So we would like to get 100% of that offset portfolio picture. So we're still hoping that the UN will come back to us. Second of all, as I said, we'd like to know whether the UN will consider reviewing the 13 problematic offset programs that we reported on. In terms of follow-ups, it all goes back to resources. I mean, we have an abundance of climate stories that we want to do and investigations, and climate coverage is a core part of everything that we do every day in our coverage. As far as the UN goes, I mean, we're going to keep pushing for accountability and greater transparency, because as we talked about on this panel today, one of the big surprising things about this investigation, and I've been doing this job for a long time, journalism that is, was the fact that so many of our questions were unanswered or ignored. And if journalist questions are ignored by big international organizations like the UN, then the public will have absolutely no chance of ever knowing anything that goes beyond the headlines or printed in obscure reports that, let's face it, not that many people read. So besides being a moral compass, to many of the world's issues that we're seeing right now. You know, the UN talks a lot about how it wants to be transparent. So in terms of our future plans, we're planning on holding them up to that promise. But being fair in the process.
We've just had a really interesting comment in from another anonymous UN official, which I think everyone should hear. Quote, UN agencies, some more than others, are donor driven. Traditional donors, US, Europe, have less funding available, so the US has to look elsewhere and is increasing turning to private sector and Gulf states. It can affect the type of language you use in your advocacy when you are beholden to the Saudis or IKEA. End quote. But that's a good line. That's what we call a good line in the industry. In case, I'd like to just remind our readers, our viewers, one more time that it's sort of your last chance now to get questions in before we take advantage of the expertise before we close down for the day. We've had another question for Joe from Eddie CED, who asks if there is any way to create a well-incentivized and functional carbon offset market, including the voluntary credits, or will the market stay broken and therefore hinder the targets to cut carbon emissions?
Well, I think that a lot of very well-meaning people, very smart, well-meaning people have tried for, over 2 decades to try to create a working voluntary program. And I think that a lot of people that I spoke to and quote in my paper think that it's just it is inherent in having an unregulated market that nobody gets to say this is quality and this isn't quality, right? There's no independent body that can do that and that anyone has to listen to. And as people may know, or maybe not, in 2019, it had become clear over the last 10 years that renewable energy projects were going to happen anyway, because renewables had solar and wind had become the cheapest form of energy, and therefore you shouldn't issue offset credits for renewable energy projects. So the 2 largest creditors, which was the Gold Standard and Vera, stopped doing it in 2019. Well, all that happened was that Qatar set up its own crediting agency, which said, we will take all comers. We will credit anything that's renewable. And so that's the problem is that, and as a result, by the way, this led, of course, to the World Cup, getting all these credits that weren't real, and ultimately was taken to the Swiss, a regulator, and the Swiss regulator said this is all bogus. But literally, in the last month or two, the Saudis set up their own offset creditor to issue carbon offsets to the Saudis' own polluting companies, right? So we're living in a world where anyone can set up an offset crediting organization and issue offset credits for meaningless stuff at a low price. And since it's an unregulated market, there's no one to stop them, and there's no one to say these credits are real and those aren't. So I don't think that the voluntary market can solve this problem. And by the way, this problem was identified in the scientific literature way back in 2001, which says if you set up this system, both sides have an incentive to exaggerate. The seller is not getting paid a lot of money per ton, right? $2, $3, $4, right? So they have an incentive to, overstate how many emissions that they are really selling. But the buyer, right, they're just trying to get as much public credit as possible for emissions reduction. So they don't have any incentive to say, oh, you've overestimated the credits, right? Normally it's the buyer who ensures quality in a transaction, right? So if I said to you, I was going to sell you 10 real oranges and I sold you 5 fake oranges, but charge you for 10 real ones, right? You would object, right? But in the voluntary market, we're selling basically a negative quantity of a product that you can't measure. So no one is incentivized to get these numbers right. And so I don't think you can fix that problem. I do think that if the UN in COP28 and beyond can finalize the rules for what an official, a authorized offset is. That offset in a regulated market where people are, closely scrutinizing them, those offsets will be more real, and importantly, they will be priced at a higher level. And I just urge anyone from a developing country who is listening to this. Part of the reason I wrote this report is that Singapore and South Korea and Switzerland are going around making deals with developing countries for tons, as you may know. And my concern is that they're getting paid a small amount of money, maybe better than what the voluntary market is, but maybe it's only $20 a ton. But as I discuss in my paper, the correct price for one of these authorized offsets has to be around $100 a ton. And I don't want to get into the reasons why that is, but the short answer is the way an authorized offset is set up is the country that sells the offset has to pretend they didn't make the offset, so that the country that purchased it can pretend that they did. And that means that they ignore the emissions reduction in their baseline that they publicly announced to the entire world, which means if they're going to get to net zero, they're going to have to buy the same tons that they just sold later on in the marketplace at a much higher price. And the World Bank put out a report in February, which said, in this situation, the correct price for an offset is not what it costs you to do the offset, it's what it costs you to replace this offset at a later time. And that is much, much larger. And this is a complicated issue, but it is really, really important to understand, because I have a great fear that a lot of countries are getting ripped off right now. And yes, I see that you posted that the UN has bought its offsets for $1.30 on average. Shouldn't it tell you something that a ton of CO2 offset is $1.30? I mean, the European trading system, which is the closest thing you have to trading real tons, right? Every country is serious. They've committed to go to zero, right? They have a shrinking cap, and it is regulated. So people are paying attention. And that price is 100 a ton. So if you're not paying anywhere near 100 a ton, you are buying garbage. And it should be pretty clear that we're not going to solve the problem of climate change for $1 a ton. And if we could, again, all of us would be doing something else for a living. And it is embarrassing that the United Nations could possibly believe that any of these tons are real. And I'll just end by saying it took me a long time to realize this. The worst thing about the voluntary market is that it has persuaded many countries and many companies that there is a vast sea of cheap tons in the developing world that they can just skim off, and therefore they can make whatever commitment they want because they're not going to have to reduce emissions. They'll just pay developing countries a couple bucks a ton. And that is offensive. It is climate imperialism, and it is ridiculous. That's not what it costs to make a real reduction. And when we move to the world of authorized reductions, those tons are going to be expensive, and developing countries will be paid the proper price for giving up those emissions reductions. And people just need to understand that we need to move to a world where things are real, and we have to move away from a world where things are pretend, because the climate crisis is self-evidently getting worse every year. And if it wasn't obvious before this year, I hope this year has persuaded people that yes, we're accelerating global warming. The impacts are hitting every single country in the world, and it's time to stop playing these games.
That's super, Joe. Thank you. And I know it's going to be hard for anyone on the panel to follow that. But we have one final question in from Hanne Siversen at NORAD in Norway, the Norwegian Development Agency. And she asks if anyone on the panel has any advice to donors on how best to encourage our development partners to improve reporting and progress on climate goals, including greenhouse gas emissions reductions, both for offices and projects, and increasing transparency. Diko, did you have any thoughts on how donors can do that, perhaps from MSS perspectives?
So I would not say that I have a recipe for donors, but I can tell you what we are doing at MSF. I think the first thing that we try to do is that, yes, we know that we embark on a long journey. And I would say the journey is more important than the destination. So we really try to set some specific and time-bound objective related some of the most impactful activities of our organization, namely energy, supply, travel, staff, and waste, and so on. So we really try to be specific with our objective. The second thing that we try to do is also to be transparent and accountable. So that's why we are doing our carbon footprint. And in order to be, I would say, transparent and accountable, we use a common methodology for carbon accounting, because I think it was said during the discussion, depending on the methodology that you use, you can get different results. So we try to use a common methodology that is becoming widely used in the humanitarian sector, that is called the humanitarian carbon calculator, because the idea is really to explain how we did calculate our emission and to provide, I would say, a little bit more transparency in the process. And finally, something that we try to do also is really to report on the progress made, but also to report on what is not working, because the idea is also to better identify where further effort are required. And I think it's quite important for humanitarian actors to share the positive and negative experience, I think, to learn from each other, to see what could be the solution that could be deployed in our context. And for that, we are working closely with the partner that is called Climate Action Accelerator. It was mentioned at some point in the chat, because I think it's very important to share our experience and to learn each other.
That's brilliant. Does anyone have any further comments they would like to make on that question or anything else? Okay, I will going to share a final comment from an anonymous attendee before we wrap up then. Quote, in case we're forgetting, the UN also comprises of humans, and humans have made tackling climate change a real mess. The lack of will by humans to take the right action is on display everywhere, end quote. And yeah, it is a very human problem. Okay, so unless anyone has anything else they would like to say, speak now or forever hold your peace. I think we can wrap up there. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. There is a newsletter that should be you can subscribe to. You can subscribe to our socials, and I will also be traveling to COP28 in Dubai in a couple of weeks for the new Humanitarian. So if you would like to link up with me there to discuss any of the issues that we have covered today, or around some of the loss and damage agenda, around the climate and fragility and security agenda, that is turning up in a big way, please do reach out to me also. And with that, we will leave it there. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us.